After months of planning his fake death, he finally attended his own funeral in disguise. That's when he realized his wife had been planning his real death all along. What started as an insurance fraud scheme became a fight for survival when David Mitchell discovered the woman he'd been married to for 12 years was actually a serial killer who'd been hunting him from day one. This is that story. David Mitchell had always considered himself the smartest person in any room, a financial advisor from Chicago with a razor-sharp mind for numbers and an even sharper eye for opportunity. At 42, he'd built what appeared to be a perfect life in the suburbs of Lake Forest, complete with a successful consulting firm, a beautiful wife, and a lakefront home. But when his construction business went bankrupt last spring, leaving him drowning in debt with creditors circling like vultures, David saw a solution that most people would never dare consider. The bankruptcy hadn't been his fault. A major client had defaulted on a $2 million contract, triggering a cascade of financial disasters. Insurance fraud, specifically his own death. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. He had a $2 million life insurance policy through Northwestern Mutual that he'd been paying into for 15 years. His wife Rebecca would collect the payout, they'd split it secretly, and he'd disappear to start fresh in Costa Rica under a new identity. It was supposed to be a partnership, a desperate husband and his devoted wife against the world. Rebecca had been supportive throughout the bankruptcy proceedings, never once complaining about the lifestyle changes. She'd even suggested they downsize, sell her jewelry, whatever it took to get through the crisis together. Her unwavering loyalty during his darkest hour had made David love her even more deeply. For 6 months, David meticulously planned every detail. He researched drowning statistics in Lake Michigan, studied Coast Guard search protocols, and even practiced holding his breath underwater until he could stay submerged for nearly 3 minutes. He created a false identity complete with passport and driver's license, opened offshore bank accounts, and researched plastic surgeons in Central America. The accident happened on a foggy Tuesday morning in October. David took his sailboat out alone, as was his habit, but this time he had scuba gear hidden below deck. 5 miles offshore, he sent a distress signal, capsized the boat, and disappeared beneath the waves. When the Coast Guard arrived 20 minutes later, they found only debris and his life jacket floating empty on the surface. Rebecca played her part perfectly. She sobbed at the press conferences, pleaded with volunteers to keep searching, and even hired a private investigator when the official search was called off after 2 weeks. David watched it all from a cheap motel in Milwaukee, his hair dyed black and a fake beard covering his jaw. She was magnificent. He fell in love with her all over again. But as the insurance investigation dragged on for months, David began to notice things that didn't add up. Rebecca had hired a very expensive attorney, far beyond what their remaining savings could afford. She'd also started seeing a grief counselor, Dr. Marcus Stevens, 3 times a week. David had never heard her mention any Dr. Stevens before. The first real warning came when David broke into their house while Rebecca was at work. Hidden in her jewelry box, underneath her grandmother's pearls, he found a burner phone. The call log showed dozens of conversations with someone listed only as MS, Dr. Marcus Stevens. But when David called the number, a man answered with a voice he recognized. It was Tony Castellano, a guy from his old neighborhood in Queens, who'd done time for assault with a deadly weapon. David's hands shook as he hung up. Why would Rebecca be talking to Tony? How did she even know Tony existed? They'd never met, and David had carefully avoided mentioning his rougher childhood connections to his respectable suburban wife. The answer came 3 days later, when David followed Rebecca to what he thought would be a grief counseling session. Instead, she drove to a warehouse in Gary, Indiana. David watched from across the street as Rebecca met with Tony and 2 other men he didn't recognize. The conversation lasted 45 minutes, and when Rebecca left, she was carrying a manila envelope. That night, David broke into the house again and found the envelope hidden behind their wedding photo. Inside were detailed photographs of him taken over the past 2 months, pictures of him at the Milwaukee motel, pictures of him buying hair dye at a CVS, pictures of him walking along the waterfront where he'd been planning to watch his own funeral. At the bottom of the stack was a handwritten note in Rebecca's careful cursive: confirm kill before final payment. Make it look accidental. David's world tilted off its axis. His loving wife, his partner in crime, had been planning to actually murder him all along. The grief counseling sessions were planning meetings. The expensive lawyer wasn't for the insurance claim. He was probably cleaning up loose ends. But the worst part was the timestamp on the photographs. They dated back to before his fake drowning. Rebecca had been having him followed for months, maybe longer, which meant she'd known about his plan all along and had been orchestrating her own version of it. David realized with growing horror that Rebecca had never intended to split the insurance money with him. She'd planned to collect it all by making sure he was actually dead. The funeral was scheduled for the following Friday at Greenwood Cemetery, just outside Chicago. David spent 3 days preparing his disguise, not just to avoid recognition, but to gather evidence. He bought a high-quality camera with a telephoto lens, borrowed a van with tinted windows, and practiced his fake limp until it looked natural. On the day of the funeral, David arrived early and positioned himself across the street. He wore thick glasses, a gray wig, and walked with a cane, playing the role of an elderly mourner from a distance. Rebecca looked stunning in black, her red hair pinned up elegantly, tears streaming down her face as she greeted the crowd of mourners. But David's attention wasn't on his grieving widow. He was photographing every face in the crowd, especially the ones that didn't belong. Tony Castellano was there, dressed in an ill-fitting suit, lurking near the back. So were the two men from the warehouse meeting. And there was a fourth man David didn't recognize, wearing an expensive watch and talking quietly into a Bluetooth earpiece. The service was beautiful. Rebecca had spared no expense. White lilies everywhere, a string quartet, and a mahogany casket that probably cost more than David's monthly mortgage payment. She gave a tearful eulogy about their 12 years of marriage, about his dreams of sailing around the world, about how much she'd miss his terrible jokes and his habit of singing off-key in the shower. David found himself getting emotional despite everything. This woman had shared his bed for over a decade. She knew his coffee order, his favorite TV shows, the scar on his shoulder from falling off his bike when he was 8. How long had she been planning to kill him? After the eulogy, as mourners filed past the casket to pay their respects, David noticed something that made his blood freeze. Rebecca wasn't just accepting condolences. She was having quiet, intense conversations with specific people, and she kept checking her phone. Then David saw her nod to Tony, who immediately left the cemetery and got into a black SUV with Illinois plates. Through his telephoto lens, David could read the license number. He wrote it down, along with the time, 3:47 p.m. The burial portion of the service was smaller, just family and close friends. David moved closer, hiding behind a massive oak tree about 50 yards away. Rebecca threw the first handful of dirt onto the casket, sobbing loudly enough for everyone to hear. But David was watching her face, not listening to her cries. And in the split second when she thought no one was looking, Rebecca's expression changed completely. The grief disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. She checked her phone again, typed a quick message, and slipped it back into her purse. Within minutes, 3 people left the burial site. Tony in his SUV, the man with the Bluetooth earpiece in a silver BMW, and Rebecca's sister Karen in her red Honda Civic. David realized they were coordinating something, and it was happening right now. As the remaining mourners began to disperse, David made a crucial decision. Instead of following Rebecca, he followed Karen. Karen drove directly to the Fairfield Inn on Route 112, about 15 minutes from the cemetery. She parked in the back lot and went to room 237. David waited in his van, camera ready, until Karen emerged 20 minutes later, carrying a small duffel bag. But she wasn't alone. Tony Castellano came out behind her, along with the man with the Bluetooth earpiece. They stood in the parking lot, having an animated discussion, and David could see Tony counting money from the duffel bag. Then Karen handed Tony what looked like a keycard and pointed toward the highway. Tony got back in his SUV and drove off in the direction of Milwaukee. David's stomach dropped. They knew where he was staying. They'd found his motel. He abandoned his van and stole a motorcycle from the hotel parking lot, racing toward Milwaukee with a growing sense of panic. If Tony was heading to his motel with a keycard and a bag full of money, David had maybe an hour before they discovered his room was empty and realized he'd been at his own funeral. David reached the Sunset Motel 45 minutes later. Tony's black SUV was parked outside room 127, David's room, but the room was dark and there was no movement. David circled the building and approached from the back. The window to his room had been pried open. David could see Tony inside with a flashlight, going through David's belongings. But Tony wasn't alone. There was a second man David hadn't seen before, bigger and meaner looking, holding what appeared to be a syringe. David crept closer to the window and heard Tony talking on his phone. "Yeah, he's not here, but all his stuff is. Looks like he ran recently. Probably this afternoon. You want us to wait?" A pause. "Got it. We'll make it look like an overdose, just like you said. Heroin, right? Yeah, I got the stuff that looks like his fingerprints will be on the needle." Another pause. "Don't worry, Rebecca. By tomorrow morning, David Mitchell will be really dead, and you'll be $2 million richer." David's hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold his phone to record the conversation. Rebecca wasn't just planning to kill him, she'd already paid professionals to do it. The funeral wasn't just a performance for the insurance company. It was cover for her real plan. But David still had one advantage. Everyone thought he was either dead or about to be dead. No one was expecting him to fight back. Over the next 6 hours, David became someone he'd never been before. He broke into Tony's SUV and found detailed files about himself, including his real location, his new identity documents, and photographs dating back almost a year. Rebecca had been planning this since before the bankruptcy, which meant his financial troubles had just given her the perfect opportunity. More disturbing were the files about 3 other men, other husbands, other insurance policies, other accidental deaths over the past 5 years. Rebecca wasn't just a murderous wife, she was a serial killer. David also found Tony's real phone, not the burner. The text history told the entire story. Rebecca had been recruiting lonely, financially struggling men, marrying them,
taking out large insurance policies, and then having them killed. She'd done it in Phoenix, Dallas, and Denver. Chicago was supposed to be her retirement job. The man David had thought was the love of his life was actually a predator who'd been hunting him from the moment they met. But Rebecca had made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated David's intelligence and overestimated Tony's competence. When David didn't show up at the motel, Tony panicked and called Rebecca repeatedly, creating a phone record that connected them directly. David copied everything from Tony's phone, took photographs of all the documents, and then called the FBI. Special Agent Sarah Chen met David at a 24-hour diner in Kenosha at 3 a.m. She listened to his story with growing amazement, reviewed his evidence, and immediately put David into protective custody while they built their case. The arrests happened simultaneously across 3 states. Rebecca was taken into custody at her grief counseling appointment, which turned out to be a real session because the stress of coordinating multiple murders had actually been affecting her mental health. Tony and his crew were arrested at the motel, still waiting for David to return. The trial made national news. The Black Widow of the Midwest, the headlines called her. Rebecca Michelle Crenshaw, not even her real name, had been married 6 times and widowed 5. David was the only husband who'd survived, and only because his own criminal plan had accidentally saved his life. During the trial, more details emerged. Rebecca had a psychology degree and had been studying grief patterns to perfect her grieving widow performance. She'd specifically targeted men with financial problems because they were more likely to take desperate measures, making their deaths easier to explain. She'd married David because his insurance policy was the largest she'd ever encountered, and she'd been planning his death from their wedding day. In her final statement before sentencing, Rebecca looked directly at David, who was sitting in the gallery wearing a bulletproof vest. "You were supposed to be easy," she said calmly. "Stupid and desperate and easy to manipulate, but you were always too smart for your own good, David. That's why I had to kill you." Rebecca received 5 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. Tony and his crew got 25 to life for conspiracy to commit murder. David testified for the prosecution and was granted immunity for the insurance fraud in exchange for his cooperation. The insurance company quietly settled with him for an undisclosed amount, reportedly enough to pay off his debts and start over somewhere safe. 6 months later, David moved to a small town in Oregon where nobody knew his story. He opened a bookstore and started taking sailing lessons again, though he never went out on the water alone. Sometimes, late at night, David still wakes up thinking about that moment at the funeral when Rebecca's mask slipped. The cold, calculating look in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. He wonders how many times she'd looked at him that way during their marriage without him noticing. But mostly, David tries not to think about how close he came to getting exactly what he'd planned for, just not the way he'd planned it. The bookstore is doing well. David has made friends with his neighbors, joined a hiking club, and even started dating a veterinarian named Sarah who thinks his name is Michael, and that he moved to Oregon after his wife died in a car accident. It's not entirely a lie. Rebecca did try to kill him, and David Mitchell is legally dead according to the state of Illinois. The man who lives in Oregon now is someone different, someone who learned that sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is the one sleeping next to you. Every year on the anniversary of his fake death, David gets a letter forwarded through his lawyer. No return address, but he knows who sends it. Rebecca, writing from her cell in the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. The letters are always the same, just 2 words, written in her careful cursive, "Almost darling." David has never responded, but he keeps the letters in a safety deposit box along with copies of all the evidence that put Rebecca away. Insurance, he calls it, in case she ever gets out and comes looking for him again, because David knows something that nobody else does. During the trial, when Rebecca was describing her other victims, she mentioned a detail that wasn't in any police report, a detail that only the real killer would know. Rebecca didn't just plan the murders, she carried out at least 2 of them personally. The deaths she'd claimed were accidents were actually hands-on killings, which means the woman David married, the woman who'd cried at their wedding and laughed at his jokes and whispered "I love you" in the dark, that woman was a predator who'd looked into her husband's eyes and watched the life leave them. David had planned to fake his death for money. Rebecca had planned to make it real for the same reason. In the end, they'd both gotten what they wanted. David had disappeared completely, and Rebecca had become a widow, just not the way either of them had expected. If this story shocked you, wait until you hear about the woman who discovered her husband's secret family living in their basement. Click here to watch that incredible story, and don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable true stories that will leave you questioning everything.